Welcome to the BCheque chats, where I get to interview some of the most interesting and talented founders, creators, and builders in the Web3 space. Today, in this episode number 6, I'm delighted to chat to my good friend, SpaceWalk. SpaceWalk has his own podcast and newsletter, MetaVault, and is also involved in Valet Confidential, and is one of us who has taken up the challenge of articulating the various interesting elements of Web3. So there's no person better to discuss the production of content and the strategy behind that and why it's so important. SpaceWalk, welcome to the BCheque chats. How are you doing?
Awesome, man. No, this is so exciting for me because you and I, in like December of last year, were messaging on Twitter like, "Hey, man, are you interested in doing a pod? Like, what's going on?" And here we are, being featured on your pod is, kind of mind blowing. So I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, it's really cool. Like, we were having these conversations a really, really long time ago. I guess because we sort of sensed that something needed to be done content-wise.
Yeah.
Like, what would you say looking back? Like, why do you think we were even having that conversation then? What was the opportunity we saw? What was the inspiration back then?
Well, BCheque, long time ago. This was December. Like, this was 8 months ago. So let's just frame it in the context
many
that it
moons
is, right?
Ago.
But yeah, it was many moons ago. The space still is moving so fast, and so much is happening, and so much is being built, and there's so many ideas, and there's so much creative energy right now, and has been, for the last 18 months. And I haven't been following prior to that, but the real energy starting, in that January 2021 timeframe, December 2020, January 2021. And as somebody who is trying to, understand what the hell I'm getting into, it's like somebody should be writing about, like, we're all thinking about it, like we're having conversations about it, like maybe we should get some of this down onto a newsletter or onto a podcast or in big Twitter threads or whatever it was, right? So I think, I noticed some of you, and Discord just never felt like, Discord's not the answer, right, man? So like,
No.
It's got to be something. It's not fun to spend a day chatting in Discord and then thinking like, that was a really productive, amazing conversation, and it's lost. Like, the day flips, right? And the conversation moves on and it's gone. And so thinking about ways to bring those ideas out into a space that could be shared and could grow. And I think that was some of the original idea, at least from my side. What about you?
Yeah, definitely. I think if you think about it, like, it's sort of a natural progression for an evolving community to want to begin to kind of codify and document their own history, and just to, I think that to start to document your own history as a community, your community needs to have developed to a certain point. There needs to be an established number of people who are kind of in it for at least a medium to long term. So, and also the way I think about it a lot is things that don't get written down just won't last. Like, they're not going to last if you don't have the production of content around an idea or a group of people or an activity or a shared interest. It's going to disappear because, I don't know, then the idea just stays contained in the same group of people, and it will die without people. This is like a kind of a higher level view. I'm not suggesting we would be doing these podcasts or we'd be producing this content for 60 years just alone amongst ourselves. But I just think, the documentation of a community is part of its evolution in that respect.
Yeah, and I think it's documentation for sure, right? To actually get the ideas down on paper, but then also spending the cycles to try to frame the space, like certain concepts within the space, right? So recently I wrote something about utility debt within projects, and I got some really good feedback, and some folks that I, highly respect saying, wow, that really sort of crystallized this concept that I had in my head, but you put it in a, in this nice, beautiful pearl shape concept. And now I get it. And now when I'm looking at projects, I'm wondering to myself, how much utility debt does that project have? And as they're adding on all of this quote unquote utility, like, that's just more debt that you have to service, right? And so it is documenting it, but it also, certain certain ways for the community to find these frameworks, these mental models, these like little, you know, concepts that can ultimately flourish and now become part of the canon, right? And we're all now, you know, pointing at other projects saying, look at the utility debt over there. Is that good or bad, right? And again, it's
Mm.
not a criticism specifically to that concept, but like just to be able to have a conversation around a specific framed concept. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really cool to be able to shape the narrative and conversation. Do you think that's one of the reasons why you wanted to get involved, maybe even broadly in Web3, because it's such a new frontier? Any work that you do in the kind of media realm, if that's even what you can call it, it would be genuinely kind of shaping the narrative and discussion in the space.
No, it's a great question. So I think early on, no. The answer is no. Early on, I was just trying to
Mm.
make sense of a project that I loved. Right, Pixel Vault had a lot going on, and at the time, G Funk, the founder of Pixel Vault, was doing a lot of podcast and YouTube appearances and throwing out, you know, to be dates. You know, like maybe, you know, that's happening in a couple weeks. It's happening in a couple months, and I was just like, I need to wrap my head around a roadmap, right? And so let me just document what he's been saying for the last 3 weeks and put it down on paper. So
Mm.
really, to me, it wasn't even, you know, what is this company doing, and like how is this space evolving, and like what is this company doing in relation to the larger space. It was just what's going on. Like let me just make sense of it.
Yeah.
And then after doing that for a few months, I started to notice some patterns, not only within the company but within the larger space, and then doing some compare contrast and really trying to understand, like, you know, when you spend hours and hours of your free time thinking about a company, thinking about a space, um, to me it evolved into something like, yeah, what am I doing outside of just being a fan? And you can do both. You can be a fan and still, you know, try to frame concepts and try to understand, you know, a company's dynamics. But it definitely shifted more towards, let me try to understand what's going on, you know, within this company, and how it affects the larger ecosystem, and or how the ecosystem is affecting it.
Yeah, that's really interesting because in teaching we have this taxonomy called Bloom's taxonomy, and it's a framework for how to ask questions about, or how to ask questions to pupils to kind of develop their thinking. And at the bottom rung of questions, I can't remember the actual bracket, but essentially it's just like, what is happening?
Yeah,
Like, what is the thing that you are discussing? And then you mentioned slightly after, when you started progressing, you mentioned compare contrast. And like comparing contrasting is higher up in the taxonomy because it requires a different part of the brain, which you can only get to and access once you have understood what the hell is
completely
going
makes
on.
sense. Yeah.
So it's super important to have that initial foundation in order to progress and do more interesting things later.
Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, I think, you know, we're all, I feel like a lot of us that are in the Web3 space are scrambling to understand individual projects, right? So it's, and if you're focused on just one project, I think you might be able to get there, right? But if you're focused on 10, 15, 20, however many projects that you're into, like it's hard to feel like you know what's going on in all of those projects. And, you know, certainly, you know, as we kind of entered the bear market, if it's still a bear market, you know, I
I don't know anymore.
don't know what to call it anymore. But this period that we're in, I've definitely decided to, instead of spreading my wings, you know, and getting into lots of projects, like what are the things that really interest me in the space, and then finding
Mm.
projects that are focused on those things, and then spending more time with those kinds of projects.
Yeah, it's definitely unbelievably difficult to stay on top of the variety of things. I wanted to ask, when you say you obviously started in order to make sense of one particular project, was there any broader strategy there to think, well, I want to, you know, when people talk about the production of content and strategies of how to grow and all of this and that, was there any thinking of, well, I want to start narrow, build an audience, then, you know, branch out? Or was it just literally, I just like this? And if so, why did you choose Pixel Vault?
Yeah, no, not at all. I'm so not strategic about content and media. Like I there was a moment I can say that like the early success, like the early you know, acceleration that the MetaVault newsletter had, it made me think, this might be interesting, that the space is growing. They're really, there's rabid fan bases specific to individual projects. Could you build, sort of a larger umbrella and have lots of different newsletter media content specific to certain projects?
This is what we touched on this when we spoke all
We
those
did.
moons ago in
Yeah.
December.
Yeah. And so and I still think there is a world in which that might work, right? Like if you, there's certain like ESPN.com or whatever, right? Like if you go to the NBA page, like you can find content about my local Washington Wizards, as bad as they are. You can go to the Bulls, Chicago Bulls page. Like there's different ways to consume media, right? And why not bring that to the Web3 space, and instead of an NBA team, you're just following your favorite NFT project. But that takes a lot of time and effort. And I've got a in real life job that has a lot of demands. I've got 2 little kids, and this is still a hobby for me. And so, no, I have not been strategic about, I try my absolute best to publish weekly, to do weekly pods. But when it doesn't happen, I do not beat myself up about it, because you and I also had a very important conversation to me personally. And I want to thank you on your pod that, there was a time where I was arranging, potentially scheduling a interview with somebody controversial in our space. And I reached out to you because I reached out to a couple people that I was like, hey, what do you think about me interviewing so-and-so? And a lot of people were like, ugh, don't do it. Stay away. And you were like, what do you want to do? And I was like, I would want to listen to this interview. And you're like, well, there you go. Like, it's as simple as that, right? Like, do what you want to do. And so BCheque, I mean, the simple answer is, I don't want to spend a ton of time figuring out like how to gain subscribers. I just want to write good stuff, like I want to create content that I would want to read. So, again, I really appreciate your feedback during that time. And then now I've carried that forward into, as you described earlier, the MetaVault newsletter and podcast was solely focused on Pixel Vault. And then, over the last 2 months, I've broadened my aperture to look at the space more broadly. And in making that change, that was, some of your words were part of that decision making.
Yeah, thanks for that. I thought it was a good question to ask, because knowing the person in question is very worthwhile, like just double checking and getting a sense of what kind of reception would be. But I definitely believe that. And actually, before we speak about where you're going and why you decided to change, I just wanted to kind of touch on that, which is like when you focus so closely on a project, to what extent did you feel imprisoned by only being able to speak about that? And also, in a way, because the community are the people who you're creating for, right? You're creating for a specific community. What happens when you want to be slightly more critical or want to raise certain questions, when you know that you're sort of creating for the community? So how do you manage as an independent creator, and as you say, go after what you want, because ultimately that's what you want to do. You don't want to go by someone else's strategy or produce content for people you want to produce content for people, but you want to do good stuff that you want to do. So how do you manage that balance between producing what you want versus, okay, well, this is the community I'm producing for?
Yeah, no. So first off, I appreciate the way that you frame that. Basically, everything that I create is for the community. It's never for a company.
It still is, right?
Yeah, and it still is, right? I mean, the whole concept is I want to write and think and create interesting work that the community will want to read and want to consume. And so that's always important, right? And as a community member, though, you can still have doubts about a project. You can still have questions about a project. You can still try to better understand the thinking of a project by asking questions. And I mean, the way that I took it was, I'm not, again, so to go back to your earlier question, I'm not like engagement farming. I'm not trying to up the number of subscribers. I'm not trying to get, 150 retweets. Like, that's not my desire. My desire is to, again, spend time thinking about something that I'm passionate about and hopefully producing something that the community finds value in. And so I did that and was critical at times and had lots of questions. And I heard zero negative feedback from the community, which is
Interesting.
I mostly got things like, I really appreciate you putting into words this thing that I've been thinking for a while. Those kinds of things. Right. And so that was fun. Right. At the same time, I don't know if I made the company, I don't know if I made PixelVault kind of grumpy at times, but from my perspective, um, it was the conversation happening in the space anyway. And to bring it out to a platform, publicly was, again, with respect, with making sure that I was not pushing the line just to push the line, but asking tough questions and being honest about it.
I think there's a super important question to ask here, which would be very helpful to the people who are interested in this type of thing, which is, look, generating and producing community-based or community-related content, which is then, okay, fine. On the one hand, you're creating this content for yourself because that, first and foremost, you want to be proud of what you do. It's also for the community because it wants to serve this greater purpose. But there is obviously the third actor in this game, which is the company itself, the people who produce the content. So how did that, how did your production of the media uh, affect that relationship, or was there any kind of fracturing at all?
I don't know. So I mean, I think the newsletter. It's interesting, man. I mean, you as someone who writes newsletters every week, you write this newsletter, you put a ton of work into it, and then you make this one little pod that's like a 35-minute recording, and you publish the thing for, it takes another hour, and you publish the thing, and then a bunch of people listen to it and then provide feedback, and it feels more visceral somehow, right? So, and look, the podcast that we had, that I had with my co-host Brad Barrett, was more visceral. It was like the emotions were more ramped up, and some of the criticism was more ramped up too. And if we had any kind of feedback from the company, it would be more based around, I think, the podcast than the actual newsletter. I think if anything, the newsletter, I got good feedback from the company saying, it's funny. I could even hear sometimes them using phrases that I wrote in the newsletter, like in their town halls or community calls. So I know they read it.
Yeah.
I know that they shared it. And I appreciate that. Right. I mean, that's good.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think as the podcast got more critical and was really trying to dive into some of the dynamics of the company, not just project, but really trying to dive into why is the company doing this? Not just, this specific drop or whatever, but some larger questions that we had. And I didn't hear specifically from them, but there was some, not definitely not shade, definitely no negativity, but it got quieter between us. Let's say that.
Yeah. That's interesting. So how do you think, as an individual, being the person, with your name front and center on the project, I know you were doing that with Brad also, but how did that make you feel, and how did you kind of manage your own emotions in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Again, if from my perspective, I think we were being honest and respectful. Having said that, if I started a company and this was my baby and I worked 20 hours of the 24 hours a day on it, and somebody was telling me my baby was ugly, and maybe just ugly for a day, maybe just ugly for a month, but my baby was ugly, I wouldn't be too happy either, right? And so there was a side of me who, and to the reason that I ended up sort of pivoting and going to a more open and broader aperture for the larger ecosystem was because I also didn't really enjoy on a weekly basis jumping onto a podcast with my co-host and us being grumpy. We started as cheerleaders. Yeah. We started this podcast to be, to be super excited. And we were super excited for months. And then at a certain point we got pretty grumpy, and that's not fun. There's really no true joy in doing that. Again, still good feedback from the community and people excited and wanted to listen to it on a weekly basis. But I just didn't appreciate that. That's not my energy. I don't live in the world where I walk around being grumpy about projects and stuff. I get excited about stuff, and I'm a very optimistic person. So doing that on a weekly basis was actually pretty hard for me at some point. and Brad too. And Brad and I had a very honest conversation between us, and was like, what are we doing here? Like, this is not the
Mm.
original idea that we had going into this thing. Which, should we do something moving forward? Should we do something different? Like, what's the next step?
So that all makes a lot of sense. It seems strikingly obvious that what it had become was not the inspiration for why it started. So how did you manage the transition then? Because you were doing this with Brad, who you were doing a great job with. How did you manage to, move across into this new avenue?
So by talking to people like you, you and I was like, I'm thinking about this thing. Can we chat? And that's
Mm,
that's what I do generally too. BCheque. I mean, like, when I'm thinking about something and trying to work through something, I'll just reach out to people and ask them. I
yeah.
mean, I've been lucky enough to build, really amazing friendships in this space. And when I'm thinking about something, it just blows me away, BCheque, the kind of people that are in the space. Not
Mm,
nice people are
yeah, me
great,
too.
but like, these people are like pros, right? Like, people that have amazing backgrounds. And so when I reach out to them and ask them, how, to help me talk through this, work through this, think through this, like, these are amazingly skilled, like, professional, like, amazing resources, right? And so I reach out to people and I'm like, hey, here's what I'm thinking, and got different feedback on different concepts, different ideas, and then went with what I thought made sense for me, and ultimately, again, kind of made it a sharp turn, after a little bit of a pause, and now I'm kind of swimming through the open sea, pardon the pun, of all these different projects and these concepts, and trying to find, I guess, kind of my voice in this world, right? Like, in this larger space. It was very, very easy. Brad and I joked that, like, we would jump on the podcast for, we jump in the recording studio or whatever for 2 minutes, go, what are we talking about today? Got it. Let's go. And we'd record.
Mm,
But then when you open the aperture and say, hey, Brad, we're going to talk about 10 KTF today. And he's like, what is that? Like,
yeah.
that's you've got to really, coordinate a lot more and get schooled up on things a lot more than just showing up and talking about a project. So that's ultimately why I decided to go solo. Not at all because Brad and I had any issues with each other. I love that dude. Amazing guy, really incredible. It's just easier for me to manage moving forward.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what do you think, like, what is, as you move forward solo, what are the opportunities that you see that you'd like to explore?
So I think so. We've been talking mostly about MetaVault, but the other newsletter that I built, co-founded with Filmbook, another friend that I met in this space, called Valet Confidential, which is focused on Jenkins the Valet, but the larger, Tally Labs is the company that built Jenkins the Valet. They just released their Bored and Dangerous book, written by Neil Strauss, and then Azerbala is their, actually, I think it'll be about a 14,787 count PFP project, and they're building a whole world around it, right? And so what I'm really interested in are these projects like Chimpers as well. Shout out to those guys; they're
Mm,
amazing members of this space, but projects that are trying to tell stories, and really interested in the community helping to tell these stories, not just, listen to what we're telling you, listen to this world that we're building, but let's build like a fabric that you can now, build a canvas that you can now draw on with us. And so that's what, Valley Confidential spends a lot of time thinking about, um, Tally Labs, Jenkins, and the world that they're growing and the kind of stories that they want to tell and how they start from story first. And I mean, think about this, like, they have a head of story as one of their, key hires over the last 6 months. Like, how many NFT projects have someone at that level with that kind of role? Like, that, it just, to me, it solidifies how important, story is to everything they do.
yeah, it seems to be a priority for them. Also, I get the sense to just build with the community. So, like, yes, there's this element of story, which is super important, and the community is obviously a huge focus. In what way do you think with what was I going to ask? So Tally Labs, just take it back for a second. So Valet Confidential is is it documenting the Jenkins ecosystem in the same way that MetaVault used to focus on the PixelVault ecosystem, or is there some deeper connection between this kind of in the building of the story?
No, so it's a great point. So earlier we were talking about this concept that I had and talked to you about months ago of like maybe MetaVault will be PixelVault focused and that'll be a vertical, and then Valet Confidential would be the Jenkins the Valet vertical. Got it. What's the next vertical? What's the next vertical? What's the next vertical? Now you got 10 verticals, 10 amazing writers. Like, what a cool world that would be. And so Valet Confidential was kind of the first one to, first offshoot. And now, Filmbook, mostly Filmbook, but Filmbook and I, thinking and writing about everything they're doing. So their entire ecosystem, and not just, not just, the latest drop or, or their roadmap, but like thinking about how the project could work. One of the pieces that I wrote on Valet Confidential that I'm proud of was trying to understand that what Tally Labs really wants to be is this stack of tools that sit between projects on the left-hand side and PFPs, stars on the right-hand side. And stars can come into this stack to try to find projects to be, featured on. We all have this, these licensing rights. Awesome. But how do we use them? It takes way too much work to create your own character and license it and try to make any money out of it. They kind of figure that out. So, you've got your own PFP on the right-hand side coming into the stack, and then all these projects that are looking for interesting kinds of characters and worlds and stuff, and they sit on the left-hand side. And then when they come to the center, you're just utilizing Tally's tools to do that. And wrote that, and the guys who run that, VJ and Safa, wrote to myself and Filmbook, were like, "Wow, you guys nailed it! Like, that's exactly what we're thinking." And so yeah, it's a bit of, again, like what is going on in the project, because they have a lot going on too. But then also, like, what are they trying to actually achieve here? Like, what is the big thrust behind licensing IP? Like, we all talk about it, but we don't know a ton about it, and we also don't know how we could use our PFPs to create characters to potentially, be involved in larger projects. And so Filmbook and I like to think through that and write to that as well.
How have you found this kind of, the fact that you're able to write something? This is something which is probably quite unique to the space, where you're able to write something, obviously spend some time on it, try to produce something quality, and then the founders just message you straight after once they've read it. Like, that's not necessarily normal, to be able to produce something and have it have an impact almost immediately and get feedback from the people concerned. How has that been going with the Jenkins team? Well, how did it start out, and then how did it develop?
No, it's a great story. So, those guys are just different. So VJ and Safa, they're amazing.
So I remember you telling me, like, maybe even you were a bit surprised about how receptive and
blows my mind. I mean, BCheque, just the space in general, right? Like, when you reach out to somebody, you don't really expect them to write back. You just don't.
It's definitely not. It's not like a guarantee for sure.
No,
like you just don't know.
But the space is still kind of small enough that when you ask somebody to be on a podcast, they might say yes. They probably will say yes. And so one of the things I've definitely learned over the last 8 months is just reach out to people, and if they don't respond, got it. If they say no, got it. But a lot of times they say yes. So Filmbook and I were throwing out ideas about different things to do, and at the same time, I noticed that he was on a Jenkins the Valet town hall and was speaking, and I was like, "Whoa, you're into this project?" Because he and I mostly talked about PixelVault. And I was like, well, what if we do a newsletter specific to Jenkins? He was like, hell yeah, let's do it. And he was like, well, what if we start with a interview with VJ and Safa? And I was like, that'd be fantastic. Do you want to try? Immediately, they said yes. They said, what do you need? Let's set up the interview. After you interview us, how about you interview so-and-so? Then you can interview so-and-so. Like, anything you need moving forward. You can talk to our CAA agents. Like, they were super excited. They had an announcement in their Discord saying, guys,
Mm.
listen, we have a news, like the community's built a newsletter, and Filmbook and I are like, what is going on? Like, these guys want
Yeah,
to spend time with us?
and also at that point, it's just an idea, right? Like
Completely.
they're not even necessarily convinced. Like there's no. Okay, I know you had MetaVault and maybe you used that as part of the pitch, but there's no hardcore evidence that like, okay, this is going to be a lasting commitment. You just reached out, but it sounds like the response was just overwhelmingly and almost to the point, almost surprisingly positive.
Yeah, we're not Packy McCormick. Like, we don't have 100,000 subscribers, and we're like,
Yeah,
we want to provide. No, it was just like, we're members of the community. We've got an idea, and we think there's value here, and they immediately understood it, and we're like, this is driving value, and it's not even like it wasn't like a one of those kind of gross business. Like, it was just two guys on our side, me and Filmbook, going, this is exciting, we'd love to do this, and it was two guys on that side going, this is amazing, we'd love if you did this. Like, it was kind of this perfect marriage.
yeah, that's really cool. What do you think from their perspective? Because you spoke from your perspective about how it's like, look, this is a new vertical. Maybe we can do one for Jenkins. Maybe there'd be another one. It's kind of this vision of having multiple, almost franchises underneath your broad media umbrella. From their perspective, if you were to flip it around, and for other people thinking, oh, this sounds like a good idea, how do you, like, from their perspective, what are they thinking? Like, why do they think that this is a good idea? Because to be fair to them, and as you said, it's absolutely not a guarantee that founders will respond like this. So they obviously have thought, like, some light bulb went off in their head for them to think, yeah, let's get involved, let's make the announcement in Discord, let's hook them up with a bunch of other people, because not everyone does that. So what did they see in the idea, in the opportunity, that other people maybe are not seeing?
Great question for them. I don't know, BCheque. I can
But
say,
if you were to think about it, because I was just thinking as you were speaking, like, it all makes sense from your angle, but actually, if you think about it from them, they were doing something exceptionally rare, because it's so hard to get people to give you attention, particularly as you say, if you're not like the biggest character on social media or whatever, but you do produce good stuff. For them to be so on board and just and just get it. What do you think? Like, obviously you can't speak for them, but
no. So,
what's your
I mean,
thought?
yeah, and we've obviously talked to them quite a bit over the last 3 or 4 months that we've been doing Valley Confidential, and shout out to Filmbook, who just got hired by Tally Labs,
Mm.
right? So
Shout out to Filmbook.
it's
I've had a
huge, right?
number of
Let's
conversations
go.
with him behind the scenes as well. Yeah, very
Yeah, so
happy for
it's
him.
funny, like, people. It One of the first times, I'll answer your question, but let me just do this real quick,
Yeah, yeah,
BCheque.
yeah.
So people, and your recent, I think, newsletter addresses some of this. People always ask, like, how do I get into Web3? Like,
Mm.
I'm not a developer, I'm not an artist. Like, how do I get into Web3? And that was, I had the MetaVault newsletter, and that was one of the first conversations Filmbook and I had. Was he was like, how can I want to get into Web3, but I don't know how. Like, if there's anything you need, like, if I can help you at all, do whatever you need, let me know. And I'm just an individual writer, contributor, person, creator, right? So, like, didn't really need any help, but at the same time, he and I were becoming friends and talking all the time, and he had great ideas, and some of those great ideas would find their way into the MetaVault newsletter, and then I brought him into the MetaVault newsletter at some point. And then, eventually we end up building this separate newsletter on the side. And then we do good work and produce interesting content and have conversations with these guys, and are incredibly professional, and they've trusted us enough to introduce us to some of their partners and collaborators, and those interactions have gone well. And then, wow, we have an opening, and Filmbook is an amazing professional with a ton of experience, and it all worked out. Like, insane to think, like, you go from how do I contribute in the Web3 space to then being hired by what I consider, one of the top creative forces in the space. Like, insane. Like, and so again, like, he and I, we like giggle to each other sometimes, like, this is just crazy. Like, we certainly pinch ourselves. But so, to answer your other question, I think they saw two people that were really passionate within the community that could amplify the cool stuff they were doing. That's it. I don't know if they had a hope and dream of hiring Filmbook at some point. Like, I don't think it was. I think it was so pure, man. Like, if you guys can do this in a really cool, interesting way, then that's exciting for us. It amplifies the story that we're telling. It's coming from the community, so it's a different. That's you and I had a conversation again a long time ago about a long time ago, 8 months ago, about what would it look like if a company brought one of these kinds of newsletters into the company? Like,
Mm.
because it's so community focused and community built, like, can you still have the same kind of conversation when it's an official, quote unquote, official newsletter within the company? And I don't know the answer to that because that is not the working model that I have. But I'd like to think if anybody could figure that out, it'd be Tally. Like, Tally, to me, that the guys running that organization would be able to build a safe space where a mix between people in the company and community could potentially ask tough questions about certain aspects to the project, and they would be interested in having that kind of conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really tough one. I do remember the conversation we had, and my instinct has always been, in order to maintain independence, you will ultimately have to
Be
literally
independent.
just retain your independence.
Yeah.
Like, it's hard to bring someone on board, I think, and then it's just when it goes out through the official channels, someone's probably like, as soon as someone's proofreading your work
Well, and
and
so
just like,
that's the thing though, to BCheque. Like, I think when something, why do most official
I don't know.
releases feel like they feel
They're just dead
stale?
inside, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. Like, there's no
I think that's the
voice.
point. The point is to make them dead and make no one notice them.
But is it like lawyers that get involved? Like, you're the lawyer in this podcast. Like, I don't think so,
Yeah.
right? It's like,
Well, I mean, literally, I used to do, one of the things I did do at Amazon while I was on secondment there for 6 months in the London office. I was in the media legal team and I did the PR stuff. And essentially, we get these things through from the business side, and it's just like, can we send this out? And the main question we're asking ourselves, to be honest, is just like, is this true? Like, is it
is
true?
it true? Yeah.
Like, is this claim that you're making true? Is it like properly substantiated? Like, as long as there's
That's
nothing
interesting.
wild in there, um, from a PR perspective, because I mean, the business were pretty good at doing whatever they needed to do, but in general, like, whenever something sounded like, oh, this is the best something, or this is 85% something's like, is it true? As long as it's true, I'm happy to sign off on it. But
Okay.
let's not go
But
let's
truth
not go too
truth doesn't
overboard.
feel like personality, though, right? Like, and not to say that a personality
No,
needs to
definitely
be
not.
spitting falsehoods, but like, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, all the different projects that I follow, and some of them are amazing storytellers too, by the way, and yet it still feels like their Medium posts or their newsletters are like, oh, come on.
But then another interesting question then is that, okay, I agree with you, it doesn't have personality. However, say you take the person with the personality, because the thing is, the thing about the personality is that it's from a person. So say Filmbook, for example, has this personality, individual personality, which he's articulating when he writes these pieces, but then that goes in-house, and then the in-house voice is Filmbook's voice, which is great because it still has the personality, but only so long as Filmbook is writing it. So then the company has the difficulty where the voice and personality, because it's from a person, is attached to the person and not the company, which might be fine, to be honest, because if that's the person that they like to represent their company personality, then that's great. And then in future, anytime, as people move on and change and roles change, they'll always look for someone to be able to get that feel. But do you see what I mean?
I do.
We have the individual person and then the company personality, and if one becomes the other, then it's actually just the person becoming the company.
No, look, so this is something I've been framing in my head for probably 2 months, and I have not written it yet. And so if anybody steals the idea, good for you. I'm working on it. But if you beat me to it, good for you. I'm calling it Vibe Merchant. It's a vibe merchant. right? It's somebody who is selling vibes really for themselves, but when they mesh perfectly with a company, it's like this, like, Voltron, like, Avengers thing. Like you're better together. And actually, again,
Mm.
Tally's kind of nailed this. Their director of vibes, which is a fantastic title, Thread Guy, is exactly this. He is a personality that exists outside of the company, as well as somebody who amplifies the company. And
Mm.
this is an amazing opportunity in this space specifically, I think, because there are gaps in time where you're not delivering something, right? It has to happen, right? You just can't always be delivering stuff. And in that time, what is the
Yes.
vibe of the company and community? And if the vibe is fun and silly and supportive and positive and exciting, even when nothing is being delivered, that's the kind of community I want to stay in, right? Regardless of what's being delivered. Um, and
Mm.
Tally understands this, and Thread Guy is an amazing example of this. And it's weird though, like, to your point, like I'm trying to. The reason I haven't written it yet is that there's this. I think some projects have these kind of vibe, director of vibe type people, and it's unhealthy. It doesn't feel like it's giving to the community, um, and yet in the Tally example, it's fulfilling. And yet, to your point, Thread Guy is his own person. He's like an athlete to me. He's almost like an endorser of this company, right? Like a
Mm.
paid endorser. He's an amazing personality that is lives on his own, right? Has his own like faction of people that follow him and do whatever, anything he's excited about, they get excited about. Um, and yet at the same time, it's incredibly valuable to the company because he carries this gap between releases in a way that is, again, incredibly valuable to the company. So it's I'm with you, man. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about, and finding people in this space that are doing that and driving value is just it's exciting.
That's a really, yeah. There's something here. There's something in that, as you said. When you said did you say vibe merchant?
Merchant. Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
The
I
the
thought
the
you were.
post is the rise of the vibe merchants.
No,
Yeah.
it's a good idea. Uh, I thought you were going to say vibe mercenary,
Oh
where
no,
someone
yeah.
like comes
Just
in with their
bounces around.
vibes, just bounces around, giving their vibes to different people at different times. I mean,
That's
arguably
called
that,
an influencer.
yes, that's that is what that is. And it's a, I guess, depending on the person you hire, it's a difficult challenge to find the right person who is uh, able to stick around. And as you say, it's actually a really challenging time in a company's kind of, not trajectory, but those pockets of time when nothing is happening. I'm not aware of companies who have coherent strategies for that. And I guess this is an example of a group of people who are like, let's address that head on, because as you say, there are natural pockets of time where nothing can happen, and we've got to deal with that.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting question for VJ and Safa at Tally's. This was, I think they brought Thread Guy on 2 or 3 months ago. And I mean, Tally in general, for the folks in the audience, like, they released the writers room tickets, I want to say last September timeframe, and just now is, I think last week was their first NFT release since, and it was the book that this writers room built together. So that's a lot of time, man, in this space, a lot of patience,
So long.
and not to dwell on floor prices, but like it continually rose over the last year. So like they understand gaps in time for sure, and
Mm.
I would not be surprised if they've internalized this in a way that made them make that higher.
Yeah, this is a super important conversation. I'm going to have to think about this more as well. Like these gaps in time, there's probably a whole market of people who should be able to market themselves to companies to to provide value in these downtimes.
Well, and
I think that's really pertinent.
and I also think that Vijay and Safa at Tally probably thought to themselves, Valet Confidential, this community run newsletter might also be a way to fill some of these
Of
gaps in
course.
downtime, right? Like I think more companies should think about that, right? And should think about community developed content in that way.
I remember, I think we spoke about this with respect to Pixelvault ages ago, but, or maybe it wasn't in respect to that, but basically it's applicable to anyone. Just like it's the old adage of like, you don't need to create, just document things. And say you're in a period of downtime, but the newsletter comes out the weekend, you're interviewing the dev. It's interesting.
Amazing.
Like the devs are these like sorcerers behind the thing. We don't really understand what they do. Half of us are not technical at all, but it is interesting the stuff that they get up to. And I know a couple now, the stuff that they're working on, how they fit it into the broader goals of the company, like all that stuff's interesting, whether it's the dev, whether it's in operations, there's all sorts of stuff that people would be cool about. And one of the main things you see questions constantly repeating in the Discord is like, well, people just want
What's going
information.
on?
We just want an update. What's going on? Just give them something to talk about each week, with some community content. So yeah, I can definitely see how that would service those downtimes.
I think every major NFT project should have their own podcast too. Look, and you and I have podcasts,
definitely.
right? But so we're sort of biased towards the medium, but spaces are great, but spaces are different. And so to have a more controlled environment, to, like you just said, to have somebody within the company interviewing their dev about all the cool stuff they're doing would be fantastic. To talk to the artists, to have a one-on-one with the CEO saying, here are the things that are important to me moving forward, not dropping alpha or dropping due dates or any of that kind of crap. It's just here's what's going on this week in so and so company. I think would be a huge opportunity for them, and them being any company, right? Like it's interesting to think through like what kind of professionalized communication might start to mature in this space over the next year or so.
Exactly. And that's tying into those old conversations we're having about like how the way to make the opportunity in the space is to professionalize those communication avenues. Touching on this professionalized element, we've also been speaking about how we are referred to sometimes as content creators. And this is a long conversation we've had aside where we're not quite sure, is this the professional term? Is this what we are? We do respect and understand that lots of people are content creators, like fully fledged, will be in their Twitter bios, and that's what they do. But what is the reluctance, perhaps, from us to put ourselves in that bracket, do you think?
Have you heard the term CPM, like cent per million or something like that? Like it's an advertising term, like a Google advertising term. I don't know. I'm just saying Google because I'm not very knowledgeable about it. But the idea is the number of people that click on an ad associated to like a post or whatever. If 1 million people click on it, then you're getting a cent, something along those lines. That to me feels so commoditized, right? And like, I know your newsletter doesn't have any advertising. Mine doesn't either. Not to say I'm not open to advertising. Hey, shout out anybody want to come in and advertise on MetaVault or Valet Confidential. We can have a conversation.
I've got some funny stories about this sponsorship stuff. I'll tell you after.
Okay. And so, regardless, like I feel like a content creator is trying to monetize their work, right? And I'm lucky enough.
It's constant struggle,
how to figure it out. And I get it, right? And I get that a lot of people are trying to do that. And I know you and I have talked about like, do you charge for the newsletter?
Yeah, like what's the best model?
Right? Because it's not. I'm doing it as a hobby and I enjoy it, but at the same time, wouldn't it be really cool to make? I mean, there's value in it for sure. I've just never figured out how to ask money to the communities, right? And it's just something that I, personally am thought about and haven't really figured out or tried to figure out. Also, because again, I'm mostly doing this as a hobby, and yet, yeah, man, like I don't like the idea of it being a commodity. Like the idea that like on every Sunday I post this thing, regardless of whether or not something, you know, earth shattering is happening. And it's, yeah, so that, I mean, I think that's the biggest challenge I have, is feeling.
Do you think it?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Do you think it's something to do? It's like we're scrounging for clicks or something.
Well, so look, I had two very interesting conversations recently, with two people at you know, these are two different companies, bigger companies in the space. And one of them said something that, you know, from somebody I really respect, like you're a great content creator, and I hope that you continue doing it. It's really fun to read your stuff and to listen to your stuff. And I corrected him, and I was like, I really appreciate that, but I don't really see myself as a content creator. Like I'm just somebody who's really passionate about the space and you know, interested in trying to understand it better. The other person was saying it more from, you know, a different angle, saying, you know, you're a content creator, so, you know, you want the clicks, engagement. And I'm like, well, so I'm not a content creator. Like I'm not searching for engagement per se. Having said that, like, you know, obviously I write stuff to hopefully have it be received, right? I want to be received, but I don't, and I enjoy engagement. But at the same time, like when someone says you post something for engagement, that means to me that you're posting something negative just to get eyeballs. And like, so again, I had to correct this person. And then that, walking away from that, is when I really started to think through, like, am I a content creator? Do people think I'm a content creator? You know, I create content.
Yeah.
I think I kind of
Like,
am a content creator.
Technically, literally, if I was to look these words up in the dictionary, maybe. But I know what you mean. There's something about it which, look, for example, there are some very, I think it's almost a class thing, and I don't know why this is the case, because people who are pure content creators are super successful now, like hyper successful if you make it properly. But I think there's still this perception that, say for example, you were a famous, like one of the writers I like reading is Paul Graham. Yeah, I mean, you might be familiar with him. He's like I think a very successful VC investor, and in fact, I don't even know what he does. He's VC. But the point is, when someone who is hyper successful in one avenue writes, because he's a great writer and writes very well, they don't get called a content creator, because it's like, well, you're mainly this thing which is more successful than the content creating. And then, so in that respect, like the content creator role is subordinate to this either investor, VC, advisor, NFT consultant, whatever people want to call themselves. And content creator always sits beneath it. Like they won't get referred to as that. And I don't know. Well, I think it might be a financial thing. It's just like, well, people, you know, there's this thing that is more respected by society, perhaps, or is more established, at least, to be worthy of respect. And that's why they do it. But I think there's something in that. I don't know what you think about that instinctively.
Yeah, I think, to me, it feels like when you're grinding for that attention, like that's it.
Like Paul Graham doesn't have to grind, so he's not.
He does not have to grind.
Maybe.
Yeah, he writes as he wants, and it's amazing when he writes, and everything he writes we read. And so yeah, I don't know, but at the same time, like it's okay to grind. It's okay to be a content creator, by the way. Like that.
No, I agree. I completely
this space
agree.
needs professional content creators, needs people that are like, I want to build an amazing business around creating great content for the space. So like, by no means am I saying, ew, I don't want to be a content creator. It's me being somebody who has never, I didn't go to school to create content, right? Like and you and I talked about this, like, I like the idea of being able to do every piece of the creation of a piece of content too, right? So, you know, I edit and produce and publish the podcast. I write my own stuff. I edit my own stuff. You know, like I create all the graphics for my own stuff. Like I like doing all that in creating the content. At the same time, like, so one of my favorite writers is Ben Thompson. Do you know Ben Thompson from Stratechery? You
No,
may
not
notice
familiar.
if you read any of his stuff, like he's got some really kind of famous pieces. One of them is the aggregation framework, um,
Okay.
and you'll notice he likes to draw on his iPad too. And I know you and I have, have done more drawing in our newsletters.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Um,
Love the diagrams. They're the
the
best
diagram is the
parts.
best part, right? But it's a way to simplify these kind of complex, whatever. And so he's an
Yeah.
amazing writer and thinker, and at the same time, like I don't consider, and he has a podcast too. I don't consider him a content creator. I just consider him a smart person who's like building stuff that I want to read and think about and consume. And so I don't know. I mean, and so having an interesting conversation recently with a friend of mine who's been in the space for a while was like, it sounds to me like you want to provide context to the space, not just provide content to the space. And I'm like, am I a context creator? Like, I don't think we're making up new terms, but you know what I'm saying? Like it's not just, I think early on when I was writing MetaVault at the beginning and just basically trying to summarize the roadmap and like, you guys said all these things and now let me give it back to you. Maybe then it was a bit more of content creation. And then as I started to think about and try to frame aspects of the space, maybe it became something different. Because that's what I enjoy doing anyway. And that's kind of what I do in real life in my job as well. So it kind of made sense.
Yeah, it's much more that, isn't it? It's because suddenly your independent thinking is what is being reproduced and disseminated to the people. Whereas at one point it was, okay, let me make sense of your thinking and just package it in a way that people understand, which, by the way, is still a really important skill, particularly because so many people are very bad at doing that job for themselves. Um, but yeah, once it starts to develop into independent thought, independent synthesis, independent packaging up, I think that's definitely the case. And also, people really don't appreciate, like that, as you said, that one article, even the one podcast. Over time, there is so much strategy in the production and mapping out of where you're going. Like, in what direction should I take my podcast next? Okay, well, maybe if I have this person on next week, maybe that feeds into the week after. Maybe that, if I have these people on the podcast, I'll fit that into it'll like be able to feature in the newsletter. How should I share that on Twitter? Like, there's all sorts of strategy, and actually that's part of the fun parts, like being full on producer, like on a management CEO role of this independent information that you're creating.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I wish I had more time to be as thoughtful as you just described, BCheque. A lot of what I'm trying to do right now is just kind of catch up and talk to interesting people and think about interesting concepts. I wish it was a bit more coherent and framed more cohesively. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, I think it's been interesting broadening the aperture, as I said, because look, people that follow projects really want someone to tell them what's going on in the project. Not a lot
Yes,
of,
they do.
it's a different kind of audience for someone now saying, well, what does this project mean? Like, what does this space mean? Like, what am I actually getting into? And so there's a side of me who hopes, being in this weird period that we are in the current market and flipping is less, fun. Trying to degen into different projects is less fun, certainly way more risky. Maybe there will be more people who are like, well, what's going on? Like, what's going on in this space? Like, what is actually interesting in this space? And maybe the readership, the audience would be more, willing to read that kind of content as opposed to just roadmap kind of conversations.
That is indeed the hope. So what can we expect from, you obviously mentioned this phrase quite a lot, which I'll copy, opening the apertures of MetaVault. What can we expect as you move forward with that?
Talking to more people, really. I'm lining up different interviews for the podcast for sure, to have different kinds of conversations with different kinds of founders, builders, creators. Very similar to what you've been doing here on this podcast. And there's just so many different kinds of people to talk to. And then also, I do have a desire to dive into some topics more specifically, right? So I think there's a lot of energy around creating stories for ourselves with our PFPs. And I had the head of story on the last MetaVault podcast, and we built a character together, built a backstory together. It was really fun, and I got some great feedback saying,
That's cool.
like, that was I took notes, like that was fantastic. Like I want to learn more about how to create characters in the space, and so there's a whole, I think, vein of interesting content around bringing on people who know how to tell stories, know how to build characters. And so I think, yeah, trying to find those themes that I'm really interested in and spending more time with people that understand those themes better than I do, and ultimately kind of, taking those teachings and learnings, back to the community.
That sounds really interesting. And just from listening to everything you've said, not just today, but even in general, I think that is an emerging theme with you, which is getting into that kind of creative element a bit more, and like the building of story, the creation of character. It does seem that that's like a natural progression for you to focus on those types of people and projects a bit more. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, that's definitely an intent, man.
So just to wrap up, mate, it's been a really great chat. I always like to ask, as my final parting question, what you would advise someone to do. And given your specific skill set, how would you advise someone who, coming in now, hopefully more reasonable now that NFT and flipping stuff has kind of died down a bit, what can people do to get creating, producing, or building in this space?
So the first thing I would say is read BCheque's last paper. Was it paper 26? Is that the last one?
Yes, or 27. I can't
It was
remember.
something along the lines of, the path to 1,000 subscribers for a newsletter, right? And so there's a lot of good, juicy tidbits there. And I think the biggest feedback that I would give is to write, to stop writing in Discord and start writing either threads in Twitter or a newsletter or a Word doc where you're just documenting your ideas. Like, write. And even if you're not a good writer, like, just write. Because I mean, to your earlier point, like, building and creating, it starts with somebody documenting what they see from their lens, like what's going on in the space. And so we need more thinkers in this space. We need more people who aren't just building new projects, but are thinking about the new projects that are being built. And so my thing is, obviously, if you're a dev, good for you. You've got a lot of opportunities, and I'm sure you're getting thrown lots of offers. If you're an artist, what an amazing, like, energetic time to try to figure out how to, like, really grow a community. But if you're not, there's a lot of opportunity in this space to even have just conversations with people. Like we said, like, reaching out to founders, like, people respond, man. Like, if you write to me, on Twitter, I will 100% respond. Cause, like, that's what this space is to me, is a way to find, like-minded people that are really passionate about the space too. So, like, follow that passion into, connecting to people, writing about, things that interest you, and really contributing back to the community. Pretty much everything that I've done so far in this space is just trying to contribute back to the communities that I've been really passionate about. And guess who receives content better than anybody else? Fans of the project, fans of this space. And so you'll get amazing positive feedback if you're building stuff that is supportive of the communities that these around these different projects.
Very, very wise words, mate. Thanks very much, SpaceWalk. It's been a real pleasure. We'll have to do this again soon.
Thanks, BCheque. Appreciate it, man.
Take care. Speak soon.